original early CrossFit archives, you're going to see some information and some pictures of Greg Glassman putting his hand on the bottom of the sternum and finding the other hand on the pubic symphysis, on the pubic bone. And what he would do is he would set up a relationship between those 2 points of reference, and he did this a lot on the glute ham machine when we're doing sit-ups, and we want to see is, are we maintaining a neutral spine as we move, or are we dipping and moving one direction? And what's nice about kind of coming back to this two-hand rule is it allows me to do a couple things. It allows me to help my athletes understand, are we having a change in spinal position under load when it really matters most, under heavy squatting and cleaning, and it helps me to kind of quickly identify in my athletes, do I have a flexion problem or do I have an overextension problem? And consistently I see athletes who think they're getting tight but are just overextending and closing the joints off, and we're seeing a relationship change in the two-hand rule. What we want to talk about today is called better bracing, and I want to give my athletes a better strategy to generate a stiffer trunk. You cannot recruit a single muscle like the transversus abdominis in movement. Your brain is wired for movements, it's not wired for musculature, so turning on your glute medius is as silly as trying to fire a VMO. It doesn't work. What we can do is bias your positioning to try to have a certain muscular outcome, but that's really about having a movement outcome. And so the muscles of the trunk do spin and organize the trunk, but really what I want to do primarily as an athlete is develop this trunk stiffness. And if I take Danielle's elbow, go ahead and face this a little bit, and I try to hyperextend her elbow, right? Imagine that this is one of her spinal joints, and that when she squats heavy, she's used to just overextending the spine and closing the joints down. Can you show me what that looks like in your back? Bam! This is what we could typically see in a lot of our female athletes and a lot of our really good male athletes, is that they're very comfortable with the overextended spine. This looks like an active lumbar, but she's really just taken her joints, get out of that position, she's taken her joints and just gone to end range and hung out there. And now, what if I keep doing this to her elbow over time, it's going to get a little bit sore. Agreed?
It's annoying.
Right, now let's squat 400 pounds. Ready? No, it's not going to happen. Well, but if I say, hey, make your elbow stiff for me. Stiff. Now I can apply a lot of pressure to that joint, and I'm not going to overextend the joint and rely on the joint position, the joint stability, to create the kind of the stable spine. What we want to try to do is do the same thing. If I create enough muscular tension, then the joint itself isn't going to go to end range. Go to end range for me. That's not my end range position. I'm going to be able to brace off the trunk stiffness of the spine. So if we take the two-hand rule for me, two-hand rule, there she is. She makes two planes. Go ahead and stick your hands out like this, Dee. Good. Now, very first thing I do, and she knows how to do this. She takes a big breath. She gets really, really tight. Now I say extend as hard as you can. Extend as hard as you can. And what did you see? She was able to bias this position. Now she's taking her spine closer to end range, but now she's resisting her own abdominals. Relax. When we see athletes say they get tight, and the very first thing they do is change that relationship, they've gone back to, I'm not really bracing against my own muscle, like the arm rule, right? They get tight, 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 and then they release, and then try to get tight again, tight again. You can't get tight again. She had to get back into a neutral position. Conversely, or additionally, what I'll say is that when I see an athlete overextend for me, now tighten up in that overextended position. It's never going to be the same quality contraction of stiffening the trunk musculature. She does neutral and then biases that position under peak trunk tension. If Danielle gets under load, go ahead and get under load, coach. Don't turn anything on for me. Walk back for me. She's already under load and in some other biased position, and if I ask her to get tight now, get tight, like, it's going to be much more difficult for her to get organized. And most of the time what we see is we unrack the bar and then overextend for me. That's what we see. And now her spine is not in a strong position and she doesn't have her abdominal musculature to resist against. Rack the bar. When we see athletes go into the deadlift setup for me, so stand back up. The same thing is true. At the top of the movement, I'd like to have my athletes try to get organized at the top. So they're tight. She doesn't have to hold her breath yet because she may have to be able to achieve that bottom position, but I get her braced in this nice neutral position where her hips aren't pulling her into a bad position, where she's not prone to overextend. Now I bias her into a deadlift position, right? And you'll notice how much spinal control she had. This becomes a rigid lever foam roller. And what I'm essentially trying to do with Danielle's spine is create a big lever arm. And so what I want to do is let her generate a big fulcrum off this very rigid spine. What I don't want to do is go and overextend for me, is have her broken and looking for tension by extending. So stand back up. So we're going to do a bad one here for you. Into her deadlift position badly without setup. Now if I ask her to tension, typically what we see is go ahead and tension through your upper back. So we see athletes looking for tension and they're going to extend, looking to close that down, looking to create tension in the hamstrings. Now hold that position and stand up for me. Right, this is a pretty overextended, weakened position. Rib cage is flying. She can't even recruit her abdominals because she's in a bad position. If I get her organized first, now back her into the right position, now this is all set. And her musculature is going to be able to maintain the isometric positions against the big levers of her glutes, hamstrings, and quads. And now if I need her to retension, I have her bring her knees back a little bit. So bringing knees forward or back, and it's how she can retension the whole system from the big musculature, not trying to retension the system from the little musculature against the big musculature. Does that make sense? So what we want to try to do is achieve a bottom position that with an organized spine. You'll see Olympic lifters. Go ahead and do an Olympic lifting start for me.
For which?
Just like snatch.
With the bar?
At the shin. And if Danielle has enough position, we'll often see Olympic lifters start going ass to ankle. Here, they straighten the back. Now her back is in a position where she's off tension. She can achieve a neutral spine and tighten up. And then what does she do? She tightens up at the hamstrings. Now go ahead and bring your hamstrings in. Boop! And now she's set again. She's done the same thing that she's done from the top, deadlifting down, but now in this position, she's achieved a position where she can maintain a much more neutral spine. She isn't challenged by the position. She can get tight, and then she retensions from the hamstrings. This is why a lot of good Olympic lifters prefer to get tight, and they prefer this rolling start. They're using that tension from the hamstrings, but more importantly, they've become geniuses about how to stabilize their spine. So for our tight athletes, we have some athletes that can only achieve this bottom position. They don't have the flexibility to get into a snatch position, lower themselves. They have to start from the bottom. Tension, tighten, good. Now she brings back up, and now this is a fixed lever against the very strong and powerful hamstrings and glutes. But no wonder we see these movement changes when they're working against the isometrics of those positions. Does that make sense? Go and rack the bar again. So when we come back to the squat, it's important that we see our athletes being able to be organized before they unrack the weight. And what we'll show is, let me just throw 135 on here real quick. Is this another 45?
Yes.
Two different kinds of weights. Can you handle that? Okay. So we throw Danielle underneath the bar, old school Danielle. Show me that. Okay, so she's gonna unrack the weight, now walks back, and I'm like, okay, go ahead and get tight, Danielle, and try to get tight for me. And she's gonna struggle and never achieve the same kind of level of organization that she does if she does prior to the bar. So rack the bar for me. What I'd like to see happen is I'd like to see Danielle get her abs organized, get her trunk stiff, and you say I see abs, what I mean is everything, right? She's going to get tight, and she's going to unrack the bar in a tight position. Do that for me. So she's tight before, she's in a much more neutral position, she gets tight, she can unrack the bar. Now she's set, and she's going to be a lot more stable athlete. Then she can brace against that if she needs to change her position, right? But now she's much better set up to be able to squat. Does that make sense? Once you've taken 300-400 pounds off the rack, go ahead and rack again, you will never be able to reclaim your position. This is why the guys at Westside like the big machine that holds the weight and just moves it out, because they get tight and set, they unrack, and then the thing moves out. Because we don't use these things, it's really important that when we're organized and walking the weight out, it's like that is the movement that we're trying to bias. It's not, hey, I will rack the weight out, it's cool, okay, now I'm going to get my tightest self. Right now I'm just in a crappy position, and no wonder. Does that make sense? An overturned pelvis looking for that stability doesn't allow me to brace against my abs effectively. And when I see athletes dropping or extending, overextending, and it's okay to bias extension, don't get me wrong, I'm not in this dog turd neutral position, I'm still moving towards extension, but I'm against my abs. There's an old anecdotal story that the highest abdominal tension recordings ever are in the deadlift. What's going on there? As the person deadlifts, they're really having to resist that violation of the two-hand rule. Abs are contracting to maintain that relationship of the spine so it can become a lever, not so that it gets peeled apart from the back. Does that make sense? Now, you know, all of this hoopla about what it looks like and sucking your that's all dog turd crap. What we mean to do is get as organized as we can, get as stiff as we can, turn everything on, obliques, rectus, internal obliques, fire that transverse, get your glutes on, rectus, get stiff. If you're a cobra, fire your cobra hood. And that's what we're talking about. Cool? Good.